She was born to rule. A Spanish princess, the daughter of Europe's most powerful monarchs, her destiny was forged in the great courts of the Renaissance and sealed with a promise: the crown of England. For more than 20 years, she wasn't just a queen, she was the queen. Beloved by the people, a brilliant regent who defended the realm, and the cherished wife of a king who seemed to adore her. She was Catherine of Aragon, and for 2 decades, she was the absolute center of Henry VIII's world. But what happens when a king's love turns to poison? What happens when one single desire, an all-consuming, nation-shattering obsession, takes root in his heart? A desperate need for a male heir. A blistering new passion for another woman. These two forces would ignite a firestorm that wouldn't just consume a marriage, but would tear an entire kingdom from 1,000 years of faith. It would rip Catherine from her throne, cast her into the shadows of a lonely, bitter exile, and change the very soul of England forever. This isn't just the story of a queen's tragic downfall. It's the story of the betrayals, the lies, and the political machinations that were weaponized against one woman who refused to break. This is the story of how Henry VIII's relentless obsession destroyed his first, and perhaps his only true, wife. To truly understand the queen who would one day stand alone against a king, we have to travel back to the heart of royal Spain, to a world of absolute power and unwavering Catholic faith. Catherine of Aragon was born on December 16, 1485, into the very epicenter of this world. Her parents were the legendary Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, the Catholic monarchs. These weren't just any royals. They were giants of their age who had united a fractured Spain, driven the Moors from Granada in the Reconquista, and gambled on a man named Christopher Columbus, a bet that would bring them a new world. Catherine was their youngest, and as some accounts tell it, their most treasured child. She was a living symbol of their dynasty, inheriting her mother's piercing blue eyes and fair skin, her father's auburn hair, and from both, a spine of steel and a piety so profound it was the very core of her being. But her life was never her own. Before she could even grasp the concept of destiny, hers was written for her. At the tender age of 3, she became the most important chess piece in a game of European power politics. The Treaty of Medina del Campo, signed in 1489, formally betrothed her to Arthur, Prince of Wales, the eldest son and heir of England's new king, Henry VII. This was no simple marriage pact. It was a political masterstroke, a union designed to legitimize the upstart Tudor dynasty by binding it to the ancient, revered bloodline of Spain. From that moment, Catherine's purpose was singular. She belonged to England, and she was raised for it. Her education was nothing short of formidable. She wasn't just taught courtly graces. She was immersed in Latin, French, philosophy, canon law, and theology. She was more educated than most princes of her time. But woven through every lesson was one ultimate duty. She was to be a perfect queen and a fertile wife. Her womb was not her own. It was an instrument of the state, expected to produce the next king of England. Finally, in the autumn of 1501, after a childhood spent in preparation, the 15-year-old princess set sail for her new home. England greeted her with a roar of approval. Londoners poured into the streets, desperate for a glimpse of the exotic Spanish infanta, famed for her virtue and her beauty. The wedding to Prince Arthur at Old St. Paul's Cathedral was a spectacle of unimaginable splendor, a shimmering promise of a golden age for the Tudors. Afterwards, as was the custom, the young couple journeyed to Ludlow Castle on the Welsh border, for Arthur to preside over the Council of Wales. His new princess, his bride of just a few weeks, went with him. But this fairy tale beginning was about to curdle into a nightmare. The Welsh marches were nothing like the sun-drenched plains of Castile. They were damp, cold, and unforgiving. And within months, a terrifying illness swept through the castle, likely the dreaded sweating sickness, a mysterious and swift killer that could fell a healthy person in a matter of hours. Both the young prince and princess fell gravely ill. Catherine, though terribly weakened, fought through it and survived. But Arthur, the hope of England, the entire reason for her existence, was not so lucky. On April 2, 1502, a mere 5 months after his lavish wedding, the Prince of Wales was dead. At 16 years old, Catherine of Aragon was a widow, a stranger in a strange land, her glorious destiny now shattered into a million terrifyingly uncertain pieces. The death of Prince Arthur didn't just leave Catherine a widow. It plunged her into a 7-year-long twilight, a political and personal limbo. Her official title was now the Dowager Princess of Wales, a grand name that carried almost no power and even less income. The great Anglo-Spanish alliance, the very foundation of her life, was now hanging by a single, fraying thread. And Catherine was trapped in the middle of a bitter diplomatic war. The fight was over money, specifically her dowry. Her father, King Ferdinand, had only paid half of the promised 200,000 ducats. England's notoriously stingy king, Henry VII, had no intention of sending Catherine home and returning the hefty sum he'd already pocketed. But Ferdinand wasn't about to pay the rest for a widowed daughter whose value on the European marriage market had just plummeted. For years, angry letters flew back and forth between the two kings, haggling, threats, and endless political maneuvering. And through it all, Catherine waited. She lived in a state of what could only be described as genteel poverty, often confined to Durham House in London. She was less a guest and more a highborn pawn, a virtual prisoner of statecraft. Her Spanish entourage was sent home to save money, and she found herself struggling to pay the few servants she was allowed to keep. Her surviving letters to her father are heartbreaking. They paint a desperate picture of a proud princess reduced to begging for funds, complaining of her worn-out clothes and the relentless, bone-chilling English damp that was so alien to her. Yet, even in these dire circumstances, her royal spirit never broke. In fact, it sharpened. In an astonishing move, in 1507, she persuaded her father to appoint her as his ambassador to the English court. She became, for all intents and purposes, the first female ambassador in European history. It was an unprecedented role, and she excelled at it, proving herself a cunning and formidable diplomat who refused to be pushed around by Henry VII's veteran counselors. She was fighting for her own survival. Her only real hope lay with the new Prince of Wales, Arthur's younger brother, the dashing and charismatic Prince Henry. A plan had been hatched almost immediately after Arthur's death: betroth Catherine to the young Henry and salvage the alliance. But there was a huge problem. Canon law, the sacred law of the church, expressly forbade a man from marrying his brother's widow. The entire future of the Tudor dynasty rested on getting a special permission, a papal dispensation, from the Pope himself. And that dispensation depended on a deeply personal and ultimately unprovable question: had Catherine's marriage to the 15-year-old Arthur ever been consummated? Catherine swore, on her immortal soul, that it had not. She claimed they had lived together for only a short time, and that due to their youth, the marriage was never completed. She had come to the young Henry. She would insist for the rest of her life, a true maid. On the strength of her oath, the Pope granted the dispensation. But still, Henry VII hesitated. He played games, explored other marriage options for his son, and let Catherine languish. His health was failing, his relationship with Ferdinand was sour, and Catherine's future remained agonizingly uncertain. Then, in April 1509, the old king died. His 18-year-old son, now King Henry VIII, ascended the throne. He was everything his father was not: young, chivalrous, and full of romantic ideals. And one of his very first acts as king was to declare his intention to do the honorable thing. He would marry the Spanish princess who had waited for him, in poverty and uncertainty, for 7 long years. On June 11, 1509, in a small, private ceremony at Greenwich Palace, the 23-year-old Catherine of Aragon finally became what she was always meant to be: the Queen of England. The wilderness years were over. Her destiny, it seemed, was gloriously fulfilled. The first 20 years of their marriage feel, even now, like a lost golden age. By all accounts, this was a partnership of genuine love, deep affection, and profound mutual respect. Henry and Catherine were a dazzling power couple. Henry was the epitome of the Renaissance prince, impossibly handsome, a towering athlete who excelled at the joust, a gifted musician, and a sharp scholar. And Catherine was his perfect match. She was intelligent, dignified, deeply pious, and possessed a quiet grace that earned her the adoration of the English people and, for a long time, the unwavering admiration of her husband. Their court was a vibrant, sparkling center of culture, celebration, and learning. At grand tournaments, Henry would ride proudly, wearing Catherine's colors, his horse's livery embroidered with the letter K. They weren't just husband and wife. They were intellectual partners, sharing a passion for books, music, and theological debate. Catherine was no mere decorative consort. She was Henry's most trusted confidant, his political advisor, the one person whose counsel he seemed to truly value. Nowhere was her strength more obvious than in 1513. While Henry was away on a military campaign in France, he did something remarkable. He appointed Catherine as Queen Regent and Captain General of his armies, bestowing upon her the full power to rule and defend the realm in his absence. It was a staggering display of trust, and Catherine rose to the occasion with breathtaking competence. Sensing an opportunity, England's old enemy, Scotland, invaded from the north, led by their king, James IV. Catherine took command. She oversaw the nation's defenses, was instrumental in raising and supplying an army, and then, though heavily pregnant, she rode north to address the English troops herself, delivering a rousing speech that invoked God, courage, and English patriotism. The result was the Battle of Flodden, one of the most decisive and crushing victories in English history. King James IV was killed on the field, along with the flower of the Scottish nobility. Catherine, basking in her triumph, sent Henry his rival king's blood-soaked coat as a trophy for his war banners, a potent and grisly symbol of her successful regency. She had proven herself not just a queen, but a true ruler. But amidst all this glory, a dark and persistent shadow was lengthening. A queen had one primary, non-negotiable duty: to provide a healthy male heir to secure the dynasty. And in this, the one area that mattered most, Catherine was, through no fault of her own, tragically failing. Her life became a heartbreaking, relentless cycle of pregnancy and loss. Between 1509 and 1518, Catherine was pregnant at least 6 times. In January 1510, she gave birth prematurely to a stillborn daughter. Then, hope blazed across the kingdom. On New Year's Day 1511, she gave birth to a son, Prince Henry. The celebrations were ecstatic. Bells rang, wine flowed in the streets. England had its heir. But the joy was brutally short-lived. The little prince died just 52 days later. The grief was immense, a crushing blow to both the parents and the nation. And the tragedies kept coming. A son who was either stillborn or died shortly after birth in 1513. Another son, lost in early 1515. The court fell into a grim rhythm of hope followed by sorrow. The queen prayed, she fasted, she went on pilgrimages, but heaven, it seemed, was deaf to her pleas. Then, in February 1516, a moment of lasting joy. Catherine gave birth to a healthy, strong baby girl. They named her Mary. The king and queen were genuinely relieved and loved their daughter dearly, but the celebration was muted. Mary was a princess, not the prince the kingdom craved. In an age where the idea of a woman ruling in her own right was almost unthinkable, the succession was still dangerously insecure. In 1518, Catherine endured her final pregnancy. It ended with another stillborn daughter. After that, there were no more children. Now over 33 years old, her childbearing years were likely over. She had given the king a daughter, but she had not given him the son he so desperately, so obsessively, craved. And for a king like Henry VIII, a man whose ego was the size of his kingdom, this wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a sign from God himself that something was terribly, biblically wrong with his marriage. By the mid-1520s, the golden veneer of the court had worn away. The royal couple was no longer the brilliant image of unity. Catherine, now in her 40s, remained a figure of immense dignity and piety, but the years of physical and emotional trauma had taken their toll. Henry, still in his prime, handsome and vigorous, was becoming consumed by a terrifying anxiety. The lack of a male heir wasn't just a political problem. To his increasingly superstitious mind, it felt like a personal rebuke from God, a punishment, and he started desperately searching for a reason why. He found it in the Old Testament. In the book of Leviticus, chapter 20, verse 21, "If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. He shall be without children." The words must have struck him with the force of a divine lightning bolt. He had married his brother's wife. He had lived in sin for 20 years. That papal dispensation he had sought so earnestly, the very document that had allowed his marriage, must have been invalid. How could a pope, he reasoned, overrule a direct command from the Almighty? His lack of sons was his proof. God had cursed him. This sudden scruple of conscience, as it became known, was catastrophically convenient. Because at the very same time Henry's religious fears were boiling over, his gaze had been captured by a new, intoxicating face at court. A lady-in-waiting to the queen, a young woman named Anne Boleyn, and was everything Catherine was not. She was young, fiery, and full of life, with fashionable French manners and a pair of captivating dark eyes that promised a world of excitement. She was not a classic beauty, but she possessed an electrifying charisma, a sharp wit, and a will of iron that completely bewitched the king. Henry, accustomed to getting whatever he wanted, began to pursue her relentlessly. But Anne was not like the other court ladies, including her own sister, Mary, who had already been Henry's mistress, and refused to become the king's plaything. She held him at arm's length, cleverly fending off his advances, making it clear that she would give herself to him only as his wife and as his queen. Her refusal was a stroke of genius. It didn't deter Henry, it drove him mad with desire. She became his obsession, a symbol of everything he now craved, inextricably linked with his other great obsession, the need for a legitimate son, and promised him both. And so began the crisis that history calls the king's great matter. Henry's all-consuming quest to have his marriage to Catherine declared null and void. In his own mind, he was not a monster. He was a righteous man seeking to save his dynasty and his soul. His marriage was a sham in the eyes of God, and his conscience demanded he set it right. For Catherine, this was a betrayal beyond comprehension. At first, she surely reacted with disbelief. This was the man she had loved and served for nearly 2 decades. The man for whom she had been a regent, a counselor, a wife, the father of her children. The idea that he now saw their entire life together as a disgusting sin, their marriage as invalid, and their beloved daughter, Mary, as a bastard, was an attack on the very foundations of her reality. Henry and his chief minister, the powerful Cardinal Wolsey, thought they could handle this quietly. Their plan was simple: pressure Catherine, convince her to accept the annulment, to go quietly and live out her days in a nunnery. It would be easier for everyone. But they had profoundly, disastrously underestimated the Spanish princess. Catherine's piety was not meek, it was militant. Her marriage, she believed with every fiber of her being, had been made in heaven and sanctioned by the Pope. She was Henry's lawful wife and England's rightful queen. Her daughter, Mary, was the true and legitimate heir to the throne. To accept an annulment would be to call herself a whore and her child illegitimate. It would be a betrayal of her God, her daughter, and her own soul. And she would never, ever do it. Her quiet, steely no set the stage for a monumental clash, pitting the forgotten queen against the absolute power of the king. The king's great matter could not be kept behind palace doors. It exploded into a public drama, a legal and religious firestorm that culminated in the sweltering summer of 1529. A special legatine court was convened at Blackfriars Priory in London, presided over by 2 cardinals of the church, Henry's own minister, Thomas Wolsey, and a special envoy from Rome, Cardinal Lorenzo Campeggio. The court's stated purpose was to hear all the evidence and deliver a final, binding judgment on the validity of the royal marriage. For Henry, this was supposed to be a show trial, the final legal rubber stamp on what he wanted. For Catherine, it was the ultimate battleground. The scene on June 21st, 1529, was thick with history and tension. The great hall was packed to the rafters with the most powerful men in England, bishops, lords, and foreign ambassadors, all watching, waiting. At one end sat King Henry VIII, flanked by his council, confident and expectant. At the other sat Queen Catherine, dressed in black, looking vulnerable and isolated, but with a fire of defiance in her eyes. When the court crier called her name, she did not answer. Instead, in a move of breathtaking and unscripted drama, she rose from her chair. She ignored the judges. She walked past the bishops and the lords, straight across the floor of the hall, and fell to her knees at her husband's feet. The entire court was stunned into a dead silence. The Queen of England, on her knees, was about to make her case not to the court, but directly to the king. All the pain, all the betrayal, all the humiliation of the past years poured out of her. Her words, recorded for history by her loyal gentleman usher, George Cavendish, are among the most powerful ever spoken by a queen. "Sir," she began, her voice clear and steady despite the crushing public shame, "I beseech you for all the loves that hath been between us, and for the love of God, let me have justice and right. Take of me some pity and compassion, for I am a poor woman and a stranger born out of your dominion. I have here no assured friend, and much less indifferent counsel." She looked directly into the eyes of the man she had loved for 20 years. "Alas, sir, wherein have I offended you? Or what occasion of displeasure have I given you? I take God and all the world to witness that I have been to you a true, humble, and obedient wife, ever conformable to your will and pleasure." She reminded him of her unending loyalty, her patience, her devotion. "I have loved all those whom ye loved only for your sake, whether I had cause or no, and whether they were my friends or my enemies. This 20 years and more I have been your true wife, and by me ye have had diverse children, although it hath pleased God to call them from this world, which hath been no fault in me." And then, with the entire court as her witness, she delivered the fatal blow to Henry's entire argument, the one point upon which his scruple of conscience depended. "And when ye had me at the first, I take God to be my judge, I was a true maid, without touch of man, and whether it be true or no, I put it to your conscience." She had thrown the burden of the lie directly back onto the king himself. She finished her plea, not by submitting, but by challenging the very right of this court to judge her. Then she stood, curtsied to the king, and only to the king, and turned her back on the cardinals. Ignoring the frantic cries of the crier for her to return, she walked with magnificent dignity right out of the hall. She would not legitimize her own destruction. It was an act of pure, magnificent defiance. And it worked. The crowds outside erupted in cheers. Their sympathies were firmly with their wronged queen. The Blackfriars Court was an unmitigated disaster for Henry. Cardinal Campeggio, under secret orders from the Pope, who was himself a virtual prisoner of Catherine's immensely powerful nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, stalled for time before finally adjourning the case back to Rome, where it would languish forever. The annulment was, effectively, denied. Henry's fury was volcanic. He would never forgive Cardinal Wolsey for this public failure, and the great minister's fall from grace was brutal and complete. But more importantly, Henry now saw his path forward with terrible clarity. If the Pope in Rome would not give him his annulment, then he would break with the Pope. He would break with Rome itself, and he would make Catherine pay for her stunning, defiant victory. Catherine's triumph at Blackfriars was a moral masterpiece, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. It was the beginning of her end. Henry's obsession, now thwarted by the highest authority in the Christian world, curdled into something far darker, a cold, vindictive cruelty. If the law wouldn't let him get rid of his wife, he would simply erase her. In 1531, he rode away from her at Windsor. It was the last time she would ever see him. She was banished from court. What came next was not a swift execution, but a slow, calculated, and soul-crushing campaign of psychological torture designed to break her will. She was systematically stripped of everything that defined her. Her status as queen was denied. Her household was slashed, her most loyal servants dismissed and replaced with spies. Her royal jewels, the very symbols of her queenship, were confiscated and given to her rival, and Boleyn. She was forced into a nomadic exile, moved from one crumbling, isolated residence to another. From the Moor Castle to Ampthill, then to the damp, unhealthy, and notoriously gloomy Buckden Towers. Each move was to a less desirable, more isolated location, a constant reminder of her fall from grace. But the greatest and most sadistic cruelty was yet to come. Henry ordered that Catherine be forcibly and permanently separated from her only child, Princess Mary. They were forbidden from ever seeing each other again. They were forbidden from writing to each other. This was the blow that truly shattered Catherine's heart. She and Mary, now united in their shared defiance and suffering, were reduced to smuggling secret, tear-stained letters to one another, living in constant fear of discovery. Henry hoped this emotional torment would finally force Catherine to submit. He was wrong. It only forged their shared resolve into something unbreakable. Meanwhile, Henry's rage was reshaping England itself. Guided by his ruthless new minister, Thomas Cromwell, the king took the final, revolutionary step. Parliament, bent to Henry's will, passed a series of laws that severed England from the Catholic Church, culminating in the 1534 Act of Supremacy. This act declared Henry VIII to be the supreme head of the Church in England. The king, not the Pope, was now God's ultimate authority in the realm. With this new, absolute power, the end of the great matter came swiftly. In May 1533, Henry's pliant new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, convened his own court and officially declared the marriage to Catherine of Aragon null and void from the very beginning. Days later, Cranmer validated Henry's secret marriage to a now pregnant Boleyn, and was crowned queen. Catherine of Aragon was officially no more. Henry stripped her of the title she had held for 24 years, decreeing that she must now be known only as the Dowager Princess of Wales, the widow of his long-dead brother. It was a final, public humiliation, an attempt to rewrite 2 decades of history. But Catherine never, for 1 second, accepted it. To her jailers, in her secret letters, and in her own heart, she signed her name, until her dying day, Catherine the Queen. Catherine's final years were spent as a prisoner in all but name, confined to the cold, damp isolation of Kimbolton Castle. Her health, battered by years of grief, hardship, and the miserable English winters, began to fail. It's now believed she was suffering from a form of cancer. She lived like a nun, a recluse in her own small rooms, rarely leaving them except to attend Mass, her one remaining comfort. She was a queen with no kingdom, a wife with no husband, a mother with no child. Yet even in this bleakest of exiles, her spirit was unconquerable. Her faith, which Henry had tried to use as a weapon against her, was now her impenetrable shield. It was the source of a strength that the king, for all his power, could never touch. In the first days of January 1536, she felt her life ebbing away. She dictated one last letter to Henry. It is one of the most remarkable documents in English history, a final testament to the woman she was. There is no rage, no bitterness, only a lingering, heartbreaking tenderness and a profound concern for the soul of the man who had inflicted so much pain upon her. "My most dear lord, king and husband," she began, defiantly using the titles he had stripped from her. "The hour of my death now drawing on, the tender love I owe you forceth me to put you in remembrance with a few words of the health and safeguard of your soul, which you ought to prefer before all worldly matters." She then offered him the one thing he did not deserve. "For my part, I pardon you everything, and I wish to devoutly pray God that he will pardon you also." Her final thoughts were for their child. "For the rest, I commend unto you our daughter Mary, beseeching you to be a good father unto her." And with one final, devastating line, she laid bare the love that had, somehow, endured through it all. "Lastly, I make this vow, that mine eyes desire you above all things." Catherine of Aragon died on January 7th, 1536. She was buried in Peterborough Abbey, not with the honors of a queen, but as the Dowager Princess of Wales. The news was rushed to Henry. The reaction of the king and his new queen, Boleyn, is one of history's great, chilling controversies. The imperial ambassador reported that Henry and both dressed head to toe in bright yellow. Was this a shocking, callous celebration of her death? A public display of joy that their great obstacle was finally gone? Or was there another, more twisted meaning? In Catherine's native Spain, yellow was the royal color of mourning. Was it a final, cynical nod to the royalty they had denied her? We will never know for sure. But either way, they believed their troubles were finally over. They were so wrong. The story of Catherine of Aragon is one of incredible strength, faith, and a mother's fierce love in the face of impossible odds. She was a queen who refused to be forgotten. If you believe her legacy deserves to be remembered, show your support by hitting that like button, and subscribe to Chronicles of Old Tales for more stories that history tried to erase. Catherine of Aragon is too often remembered simply as the first of 6, the stubborn, aging wife who stood in the way of Henry's desires. But she was so much more than an obstacle. She was the daughter of Spain's greatest rulers, a gifted diplomat in her own right, a capable queen regent who tasted military victory, and for more than 2 decades, a beloved and respected queen of England. Her refusal to be cast aside was not born of pride or stubbornness alone. It was born of a profound sense of duty, a duty to her Catholic faith, a duty to the sacred vow of her marriage, and above all, a duty to secure the legitimate rights and the future of her only child, her daughter Mary. Henry VIII's obsession may have destroyed her life, but it could never touch her legacy. The Great Matter. The crisis sparked by her defiance led directly to the English Reformation, a seismic earthquake that shattered and redefined the nation's religious, political, and cultural identity forever. And in a final, poignant twist of fate, the daughter for whom Catherine sacrificed everything would one day take the throne. In 1553, Mary I was crowned Queen of England, the country's first undisputed queen regnant. She was a living, breathing testament to her mother's unconquerable will. Catherine lost her husband, she lost her crown, and she lost her freedom. But in the end, through her daughter, she won.